A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one important thing. It's one important thing. It's one important thing.
Welcome to the Spiritual Hedgehog podcast, where we explore the role philosophy and faith play in your daily life. Here are your hosts, Ira Gardner and Pastor Eric Dahl.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to this very special episode of the Spiritual Hedgehog podcast. But to begin with, I want to just apologize about the audio quality. We experienced some problems in the recording of this episode where we had some radio interference. I've attempted to filter it out, but as a consequence of that, the voices aren't going to be as robust or full of life as we would accustomed to have. So I appreciate your patience with us as we grow this podcast and we work out some technical issues. But the content of this episode, I think, is so important that I just ask you to bear with us during this time. And it's a rather lengthy conversation, so we've broken this episode into two parts. So please come along with us on this really, what I think is a really important conversation about emotional well-being, enlightenment as some people call it. And we're going to spend the next two episodes talking about what is emotional well-being, how do we define it, and in part two, we're going to get into how do we actually get into a period of prolonged emotional well-being in our life. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to hearing from you. And we'll be posting the entire show notes onto our website, www.thespiritualhedgehog.com. All right, let's join the conversation.
So Kierkegaard, Ira, you've been reading some Kierkegaard a little bit, and as we're thinking about these things of enlightenment, and so what have you been reading, and what's been kind of capturing your imagination?
Well, I should preface this and say that not being a philosophy major, to read Kierkegaard, I think one has to have a cliff notes next to them to, be able to say, am I getting the language right? Because it is very dense. Language. And what's interesting is that I've gone down this path of investigating, what is this idea of the concept of enlightenment? And on the same the same path, I've come across Kierkegaard's word about despair and really defining what the human condition is that creates a sense of despair, defining what that is, and then contrasting that with what is enlightenment and what is some contemporary vocabulary we can use to describe enlightenment in terms that are meaningful and measurable, that we can actually put some ways of seeing where we are on the spectrum with the goal that all of us can be blessed with the gift of health and well-being, at least emotional health and well-being is really what I'm talking about, where physical limitations are physical limitations, but our emotion and our spirit can really be elevated to a level that keeps us in a pretty positive place to be. And I was excited to have this conversation with you because when we get to the part of describing what is enlightenment, it deals with one of your pet peeves. And so that's going to be a lot of fun. But to me, what was interesting is with Kierkegaard is this idea that humans by our very nature are in a state of despair, whether we know it or not. What's been your experience with Kierkegaard and some of his works?
So Kierkegaard, I think for faith, from a faith basis, he was the one that sort of came around to saying, even if Christians are wrong about all of their theories, it's still a good thing because, it's almost that apologetic because if they're right, then, all is good. And if they're wrong, you have nothing, you didn't lose anything in the meantime. And what I took from that as a person of faith was to say, we all are looking for a path to follow. And in that path to follow, Jesus is one of many good teachers in there that can lead us to a sense of hope and wholeness and in the midst of that. So Kierkegaard was sort of the one that introduced me into that sort of thinking around that. Though like I said, I probably spent the most time when I was taking philosophy classes, back in college. And you're right, it is thick stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess what I'm curious about, Ira, is like if you were looking at those five things of despair.
Yeah, 5 categories of despair.
Yeah, 5 categories. Do you mind sharing them with us and kind of where it was capturing your imagination? I'm kind of curious where you're going to go.
Yeah, well, I mean, frankly, and as I reflect back on my own life, I see where I have gone through a progression of stages of despair that's very much in alignment with Kierkegaard. And the other thing I'm going to just throw in there is that Kierkegaard's ideas about despair have a lot in common with the teachings in Buddhism and the idea of suffering. So the idea of suffering and despair have a lot in common. What I enjoyed about Kierkegaard was that he starts out by defining it as those that are in despair but completely unconscious of it, and those that are consciously aware of their despair. And so within the unconscious, which is to me kind of maps out to the evolution of experience, the unconscious despair starts with what he calls the sensualist. And I think of it as the child that's give me a cookie, that sensual experience of pleasure that can never be satisfied, that you're always moving on to the next thing. And as you progress into adolescence and adulthood, sensuality maybe gets wrapped up in the pursuit of physical pleasure.
Right.
And in psychology, we talk about Peter Pan principle and the idea that some people get stuck just always in pursuit, having this drive that they're not even really aware of the trail of tears they're leaving behind, or even just their own despair is unconscious until they hit that existential wall, that existential crisis that all of a sudden makes them consciously aware of it. But within that other category of the unconscious despair, he describes it as the people that build systems, the system builders, the people that think they've got the world understood, the historians, the philosophers, the highly organized, that everything has to be just so, and that eventually gets destroyed through their own existential crisis that something doesn't fit the way it's supposed to. And I look at my own life and I go, yeah, check that box off, check that box off. And then we get to the, what do we do when we become aware of it? That despair that we're aware of, do we run for it and consciously seek more material wealth, more materialism is to put a salve over it? Or do we end up having a spiritual kind of feeling like other people are the cause of my problems, or they're outside of my control? That's the kind of the martyr syndrome, I think, where people are aware of their despair, but it's not my fault. I'm a product of my circumstances. And then the worst form of despair, which he even calls it demonic despair, is this idea of becoming so aware of it, but not able to do anything about it, to where you become hardened to it. And that person that just, when I think about my experiences of coming across people like that, they're the people that, they need help, but they won't accept it. And they've just gotten so hardened off in the world that that they're just going to be locked in to that lifetime of struggle, and just not able to transcend that to, in some terms we call it enlightenment, in more contemporary terms, that state of emotional well-being, which I'm going to talk a little bit more.
Well, interesting. And I think as you're as you're thinking through some of these areas, we all encounter those folks that, as you said, are just, everything is somebody else's fault. They can't look at their own experience. And I think, maybe we all go through that. It's the child who has to blame the parent on everything, and they can't get to the point of differentiating from that. I've seen that happen. I think I even, maybe had to go through a little stage where I was blaming my mom and dad for everything that went in my, life, until I got to the point to go, you know what? They were doing the best they could in raising me, and they gave me tools, and I was safe, and I had all of these benefits and all of these good things. How, what kind of turn that back in towards myself to say, what's going on here? To start asking those questions is what's causing me to need to lash out or hook on to, it's somebody else's fault. Or then, as you get to even that worst place where you do just get hardened. As a pastoral, in pastoral counseling, the stuff, that I've seen of those people that are just so hardened by the pain and hurt they have gone through. And the thing I'm curious about is you can't give them the words to work through that, because there's a reason they've gotten there. It's just trying to help them uncover what's gotten them to that place, because you got to say part of it's real. I mean, there's a real aspect of why they're hardened and why they're hurt. And so that my curiosity, and I suppose that in some senses is the question of enlightenment, is what allows, and are there tools we can give people that allow people to move away from that hardened place to being willing to be vulnerable, open up, and discover more about themselves in the midst of it, because it can hurt. It can hurt at times trying to go through that.
Well, yeah, and that's the dilemma that we have, because there's this part of you that needs to acknowledge the circumstances and acknowledge that there were some things you had free will choice in, and there's other things you didn't have choice over, in your family of origin. Until you became a point of separation from your family, you're within a environment that a child doesn't have control over, right? And so come to terms with, what do I have control over? And this is where, you hear about the serenity prayer, right? Of let me have the wisdom to know the difference between the things I can control and I can't control, right? And so I think that's the important issue of awareness, is to kind of understand where things are, but then that only takes you so far. In my own life experience, and you've known me a long time, you've watched me work through, and as I was reading about Kierkegaard, I'm sure you can go, oh yeah, I watched Ira go through that, and you try to rationalize and reason and wrestle with it, and then that only takes you so far.
Yeah. What do you do with those things that you really just can't find that place for?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I've used the image before. So a lot of times, we think of our mind as a one of those old Rolodexes where it spins and spins until you can figure out where to put that card in. The difficulty is when you just can't find a place to put that card that's going to nicely fit and not come stumbling out again and flowing through, where you're just circling and circling, and you can't find that place to rest until you can give it, in a sense, that sense of control of understanding every little dot and tittle of the world, and have it all come together. But
so this kind of gets me to, how do you get past that, right? As a child, would start as a sensualist, gimme. I remember this one priest, when I was photographing weddings, he always gave the same homily at a wedding, and he always talked about when I was a child, I spoke like a child, and he used the metaphor of a cookie jar and gimme, more. And that maturity and mature love was about recognizing the need for respect and boundaries and some of these things. And so this progression of the unconscious, where we just are biologically needy, to then when we become intellectually engaged with what I like to think of it as the world the way we think it's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get confronted with reality, which is not everything fits in these nice, neat boxes. And what do we do with that? And then we start to figure that out, and we raise our level of awareness. We start to grow into some wisdom, but that only takes us so far to where you hit that void where, okay, I understand it. I've developed all this knowledge about it. I've been able to self-reflect, but now I'm still in despair, whether that be in the form of a depression, anxiety, unhappiness, or frustration, whatever that is. And at that point, that's when we need to leap into this idea of enlightenment that doesn't come through rational reason, but comes through an experience. And in fact, been able to gather a lot of resources over the years that all seem to come down to this leap of faith. In the Buddhist tradition, there's a woman by the name of Pema Chodron who wrote a book, Taking the Leap, which really was about, gee, I did everything right, married 2 kids, and all of a sudden husband left and I had nothing and no money, no resources. What do I do? And I'm not going to, read the book if you want to find out more. But this idea of where do we get to this sense of presence,
Mm-hmm.
of recognizing that the world's this incredible experience. We're all interconnected, and we have this kind of aha moment of, I'm breathing, I'm alive, everything is well with me. It is well with my spirit, right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about how do we get to that point, one of the paths can be through a faith practice, and many would argue that Christianity, with the act of baptism, is the first epiphany of surrendering to this void of higher power, of being able to say, you know what, I'm not looking at my own pain, I'm looking up, I'm looking out, I'm looking interconnected, and I'm part of something bigger than myself, which is getting to your favorite issue of is it about my happiness or is it about my purpose, so to speak. So which that led me down a path of looking at what is enlightenment, and how do we measure it, and how do we get there. And that led me to the work of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Jeffrey Martin. He did an extensive survey of literature related to enlightenment, and looked at different cultural expressions of the term enlightenment. And so some people might call it mystical experience. Some people would call it a peak experience, get into the more contemporary flow psychology. Some people call it a transcendental experience. And this quote, the peace that passeth understanding, which I love that. Some call it a union with God, and some call it non-dual awareness. I like the idea of, we can just say it's well-being is kind of the generic term that we're looking at. And so what he's done is he's been able to map out people that are experiencing a high level of emotional well-being have a change in experience of each of these 6 categories. Starting with the sense of self, they move from a highly individualized sense of self to a greater level of distance, psychological distance, and the ability to connect more with others. They have a sense of a overall connection to the grand scheme of things that's greater than when they're in a low state of self-being, when they're just worried about their own initial needs.
It's interesting. So what I'm thinking about that is that psychological distance. Another one of my pet peeves is there's a wave of Christianity that's always so concerned about your personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and I'll say often, I don't, give a hill of beans. I'll sometimes say it more colorfully, about your personal relationship with Jesus, because I think, to me, the calling of Jesus is always towards, towards the vulnerable, towards the community, towards the bigger. But when you talk about the peace that passes understanding, it's a way. I remember one of the pastor at the church I grew up with would always complete every sermon with, and now may the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, keep, or else it might be, guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And that idea isn't that, in a sense, it is what we do hope for as individuals, is to find that sense of peace. And I like the fact that this guy's using the word well-being, because I think that's, in a sense of our purpose, is that's what we're looking for, is that's just that deep sense of we are okay, and we can work to help others see that they are okay as well.
Yeah, and I also find that when I'm in service to others, when I'm doing something for the well-being of others, I am less aware of my own unhappiness, if I had any. And that's that whole idea of that focusing on the self. It can be a source of unhappiness, a source of despair.
Right. Well, it's sort of it is ironic, right? Because this whole, I think that's what I learned in college is if you are going to look for enlightenment, it's this individual path that takes you deep within yourself, and yet what actually helps us get better into ourselves is when we open ourselves up. It's an irony. It's a tension that I think we always get to play with in the midst of our journey towards this. So.
Well, and so as we go through each of these categories of well-being, I'm going to try to bring it back around to what's the real-world application of this. When I think about friendships, marriages, if I'm focused on are my needs being met versus what are the needs of my partner or what are the needs of my friend, I always have gotten in trouble emotionally with that, because that's a very short-sighted. Whereas if two people in a relationship are focused on what is the need of the other, guess what? Things seem to balance out just fine. And so it's not what I need, but rather what do you need? And my needs will be met by virtue of that shared common trait of concern for other.
Thinking about those people I've counseled through divorce, I would say just about to a person, that the unhealthy part of those divorces is they didn't take care of this, and you start on this cycle of all the negatives of, and they weren't thinking about me for this, and they weren't thinking about me for that, and it's how you switch that to say, okay, but for healing to happen for you, you need to understand, probably go into that question then to say, and how are you doing about the work of doing the things that your loved one needed. And so one of the ways I talk about this is anytime people are in a marriage, and if it gets to be that you are looking to win a fight, you're looking to win a conversation, you've already both lost.
Well, so the next one I found incredibly fascinating was this idea that a higher sense of well-being comes about, is associated with a significant reduction in the number of thoughts. And
interesting.
I thought this was fascinating. And basically, it's this idea that you can stop having so many self-referential thoughts, that we spend so much time worrying about what is somebody else thinking about me? Do they like what I'm wearing? Do they like my appearance? Or do they understand me? All this sort of negative self-scripts that go through your life. Think about if you could eliminate all the clutter in your mind to eliminate thoughts that reference yourself, so that you can be clear and content and know where you're needed to serve in your life, to find the purpose and to become less self-conscious.
Right. I think where my brain is going to is your teenage years, and you're going through your teenage years, and you're sure that everybody is spending all their time thinking about what a fool you are, and how all the ways you screw up, and how you look bad, and how and we get this diluted sense, and I think it happens later too. So you make a mistake, and you're sure that everybody is just dwelling on that mistake all the time, and you forget, if you just take a step back and simplify, and to say, just with one thought, to say, they're all going through their own stuff as well.
Yeah.
And I'm not thinking about that, so why do I imagine they're thinking about all those things with me? So I think, but I guess the place that this pushes me also, and I'm curious and I know your love of nature, but it's also, it seems like, when we've talked about fly fishing before, the thing I love about fly fishing, even though I'm terrible at it, is I get to concentrate on that one thing of, how am I presenting that fly? How am I presenting that fly? And just that rhythm, and you get into a rhythm of back and forth, and suddenly all the clutter in my brain starts to dissipate, and I am feeling better. It's But do you have certain experiences? You say these all kind of line up for you.
They do, and yes, and I've had that experience with fly fishing. It's what I love about it, because it raises my awareness of the environment around me.
Yeah.
I'm paying attention to which bugs am I seeing, and what are their colors, and trying to pick the fly that's going to match, and all that. And throughout my life, I've had these moments of heightened awareness. But it's heightened awareness of things external. I'm aware of my perception. So when I was rock climbing, I was totally aware of everything about my body in relation to the rock. I get to have that experience every time I get on the motorcycle and have a really great ride. And so, that's actually one of the steps, and we'll get to the range of steps people could take to increase their emotional well-being. One of the steps is to engage in activities that heighten your awareness of the external world, so that you're not so cluttered with your own internal, what I like to refer to as our perseverating thoughts, the things that we just can't let go of. Maybe it was the dispute at work yesterday that's still gnawing at you. Maybe it's worrying about that email you have to write at work the next morning. The things that cause you to be thinking about yourself in relation to most of the time, it's thinking about yourself that creates a negative energy, and that we need to release ourselves from those thoughts through an engagement in strategies that can induce us to be more aware of our environment, our surroundings, and the beauty that exists in every moment.
I agree, and I think there are probably negative ways that happens as well. I mean, the other place that would often happen, and I remember, especially when I was in that sort of teenage, early young adult angst, it would be on the soccer field for me.
Mm-hmm.
What would happen is it was doing something physical, and suddenly your world becomes smaller. It's probably why I love sports. Your world becomes smaller. You can concentrate on a few things, and every once in a while you need your world to become smaller, so you can open back up and say, all right, there's a lot out there, and now I can handle a little more again. But I always joke, probably even through the time I was into seminary, if people saw me on a soccer field, they would not have thought I was going to be a pastor. Because it was just the place that, emotions and everything else. But then I would end that, and I'd be spent, and it was simple again.
Yeah.
And I don't know how else to say that. But
well, and you make me reflect on this idea of a physical participation. Being an active physical person is an important step to our overall well-being, and we need to really be cautious about the fact that our modern technology is filling our lives with email, social media posts, news posts, all these things that quite often actually trigger the opposite of emotional well-being. Research is showing that over and over and over. So this idea of getting out and being physically present in the world, actively engaged to the point of losing self-consciousness and becoming selfless and fully engaged in what you're doing is a really healthy restorative process.
Which though, you know, those exercise gurus sort of have it in that sense. I mean, that is a place of well-being for them. The question I have is where I think the tension that I can see is where does that positive addiction become negative? So there are positive addictions that we have. I remember reading a book when I kind of went through my own self-help phase in college of reading, and I was peer health educator, so we had to read a bunch of self-help books, and one of them was called Positive Addiction, and it, you know, it says obviously a positive addiction is better than a negative, one of those negative addictions that are out there. But the experience I've wondered about and continue, and this probably be a topic for a different time, is where is it that positive addiction can be destructive as well? So I guess the question I'm asking, and maybe this is taking us down a road we don't want to go today, but the question I'm asking, and I'm curious as you're thinking about this from an emotional context of, you know, where is it that, when are those times then we need to give up that 10-mile bike ride or 15 or 20-mile bike ride, or the ability to do physical in order to take care of something else for those families and those people. So I'm curious, those steps that we get to, one of the questions I have is for parents that are so busy, how do we deal with that negative thing called time, that is, you know, that tends to intercede for us too, which Ira, you're one of the busier people I know, and I think you are trying to kind of figure that out yourself anyway.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
One could argue I'm addicted to being busy, and that's been my own recent growth, is learning to pare that back and learning to make tough choices of prioritizing time and making sure. I think there's two responses to your initial question about positive addictions. First of all, I do believe there are, for people that are struggling with addiction, such as alcohol, drugs, there are definitely positive addictions that can replace that addiction piece with something. You know, quite often people will get into marathon running or some other activity, right? But I think that's only going to take you so far on the well-being scale, and that real well-being allows for a less regimented approach to life. And that I think even the positive addictions, if it's left to be too regimented, can inhibit how far we go on the emotional well-being spectrum. And it's all a spectrum, and there's no right or wrong. It's just there's a spectrum of it, and research is showing what that spectrum is. And very interesting, it's doing it both quantitatively as well as qualitatively. And so I'm going to come back to that a little bit more, because we're going to actually talk about where faith and religious practice can fall into that category of positive addiction, if you will. And we'll get to that. The next category, though, is a rather simple one. Is the idea of our emotional life. We get a decrease in the range and experience of emotions, meaning we don't have those wide jumps from the euphoric joy, which inevitably leads to the low and depressing dark areas of, you know, this idea that we kind of harmonize somewhere in between, where we have a flattening out of emotions, but we have a greater stability, just an overall going through life with a general sense that, you know what, I'm okay, you're okay, everything's okay. And I don't have the high peaks or the deep valleys in my life.
I guess the question I'd ask for you is, where have you seen that play out the most for you?
I think where that's played out the most recently in my life is just this overall sense of contentment, where I'm not actively engaged in seeking a particular joy. I'm perfectly content just being home, which has been so important during the COVID-19, to just be, you know what, I'm okay. Everything's okay. Yeah, I'm spending a lot of time at home. I'm working from home, but I'm blessed to have a home, and I just feel very, very content. So, and I know my wife and I have this mutual experience where we kind of go through patterns in a very rhythmic, almost, it's just this nice little dance that we do in each other's lives. And we come together in the morning for coffee, we separate, we come back together. And the emotions, the reduction of emotions and the greater stability is that lack of fear or that lack of drama, but rather that overall sense of everything's fine, just content, and not really trying to pursue overly peak emotion as a matter of just a more steady level moving through life. It's a more graceful moving through life that I feel like I've been able to experience over the last 5-6 years.
Were you ever an adrenaline junkie? I mean, were you one that sought those adrenaline rushes? Because I am thinking about those folks that do that too, but I've never seen you as that.
Being that at the subconscious level, I was probably more the system builder type. I certainly have been drawn to adventure, meaning I used to rock climb, I used to mountain climb. And I had a great need for travel and to go out and explore. And that inherently adds risks to some respect, but definitely the idea of going out into the world, exploring for the need for newness, novelty, inquisitiveness, etc. So I definitely fit that category there, but it was always in a very self-reflective. I've had a process of reflective journaling throughout most of my life, and so it's always been kind of a balance for me. Don't think it ever went too far. I was never that daredevil. One, I knew I wasn't physically gifted, so I just couldn't do some things that other people could do at the level they did it. So I kind of always knew what my limitations were, but I think I've always operated at the fringe of this is my ability and desire. I've kind of aligned those things really well, and I continue to do it with my motorcycle riding.
No, fair enough. Part of me is chuckling a little bit because I can hear my youngest son right now say, "Okay, boomer," and what do you, it's just, so I guess my question is what, at what stage for us, because I would say I'm the same way. I'm finding more of a peace at being at home. I still love to travel, given the opportunity. There's still trips I want to take, and I find joy in that too. But my wife is definitely more of a home person, or if she goes on vacation, she really wants to kind of set roots and be able to read and relax. And I'm finding that definitely for a good portion of my vacations or my time at home, I'm enjoying that more and more myself, which is, as you said, helped during this time of pandemic where we're just not able to get out as much. How much do you have a sense of how much you think just aging has helped you in that process?
I think that is the gift of aging in some respects.
Yeah. I'd agree.
I think I could lay out the roadmap to well-being and give it to a child, and that's not going to help them get there. Like there's no recipe for this. There is only
there's no system, might you say?
There is not. No. And here's the thing. What's really interesting too is if anybody has somebody in their life that says you need to do this to be happy and healthy, that'd be the person I would walk away from, because anything that tells you do it my way is not honoring the diversity of the frequency and intensity of life experiences. This gets back to, where does originality in our life come from? Where does authenticity come from? How do we cultivate our own creative voice in life? It's the frequency and intensity of our life experiences that kind of help shape us into growing into wisdom. And, frankly, I feel blessed to have survived young adulthood and survived my early 20s through 30s because I did do some things that were pretty intense risk-wise, and I survived enough to gain some wisdom and experience from it that helped me want to go further down that path, which is why we're here today at this podcast.
Due to the length of today's conversation, we are breaking this episode in 2 parts. Please join us for the rest of the conversation in the next episode. Thank you for joining us today on The Spiritual Hedgehog. For show notes and more information, go to www.thespiritualhedgehog.com.